Ana mana, ana reo, ana iwi, no mai, hari mai, piki mai, tena koutou, tena tatou katoa. Good evening. My name is Ian McKinnon, Chancellor of Victoria University, and with Professor Pat Walsh and all at Victoria University, a very warm welcome to this Chancellor's lecture, and thank you for attending. Before introducing Sir Paul Callaghan, let me first express the thanks of the University to the benefactors who have made this evening possible, and also to the Wellington City Council, particularly its events team. I also acknowledge the presence of Her Worship the Mayor, Celia Wade-Brown, other councillors and the Chief Executive, Gary Poole, and other officers of the Council. The deep green bunting about the Town Hall is Victoria University, but that other bunting that you see around here of wide-ranging colours indicates that this lecture is taking place during the Rugby World Cup. The City Council has been determined that at this time there should be a number of non-rugby activities, so both Wellingtonians I'm wearing a Rugby World Cup tie. I might terminate this lecture now. It's really what the City Council is determined to do is that there should be these non-rugby activities so Wellingtonians and the many visitors to our city can experience the variety that this city offers. And this dimension to that RWC is known as the Festival of Carnival and encompasses around 145 exhibitions, stage productions, etc. throughout the city, including this lecture. And the University wishes to thank the city for making this town hall available as its venue this evening. The Vice-Chancellor, Professor Pat Walsh, and I also want to thank Sheila Murray, the Director of the Development Office of the University, and other staff of the University, including those in the Events Office and Victoria University Foundation, for their contribution to ensure the success of this lecture. Professor Sir Paul Callaghan, one of New Zealand's most eminent scientists and a world-leading figure in the field of magnetic resonance research. In addition, he is an exceptional communicator in the area of science, as well as being a New Zealander who is prepared to contribute to public debate on a wide range of issues. And this evening, a prosperous 21st century New Zealand educating for the new tiger economy. Following this lecture, if not already, you will appreciate why Professor Callaghan is held in such high regard and has been the recipient of so many honours and awards, including that of knighthood. He is a Doctor of Philosophy and a Doctor of Science from the University of Oxford, a Fellow of the Royal Society and a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, the Royal Society of New Zealand's Rutherford Medal in 2005, the Peter Blake Medal for Leadership in 2007, the Prime Minister's Prize for Science in 2010, the Kiwi Bank New Zealander of the Year in 2011, plus various prestigious international awards, including the European Union Ampere Prize, the first non-European to win that award, and the Gunther Lacan Prize for groundbreaking work in magnetic resonance. He has also been the author of a number of papers, over 240 in fact, and in 2009, Wool to Weta, Transforming New Zealand's Culture and Economy. This was published, outlining a vision of an economy based on science, technology and intellectual property. Until recently, he held the position of inaugural director of the McDarland Institute for Advanced Materials and Nanotechnology, a national centre of research excellence based at Victoria University of Wellington. He has also been at the forefront of connecting science and business, founding Magratech Limited, a Wellington-based company which exports scientific instruments worldwide for research in nuclear magnetic resonance. In Victoria University's strategic plan, a key strategy is that the university must make a public contribution a contribution to ensure a better New Zealand society. This lecture is further evidence of that commitment, bringing to the public, there are over 1,400 of you here this evening, without charge, the ideas and vision of a leading New Zealander. Just as the university was delighted to award Professor Sir Paul Callaghan an honorary doctorate in December last year, we are now indeed honoured that he should be with us again, this time to deliver the 2011 Chancellor's Lecture. Please welcome Professor Sir Paul Callaghan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks. Thank you. Well, Pomare, kia ora tātou. I'm just astounded at this turnout tonight. I'm just delighted that so many of you have come along here, and I just am trying to work out why this might be. And I think it could be something to do with the crazy title I chose for this lecture of mine. I mean, who could imagine the words prosperity in New Zealand in the same sentence, or the idea of a tiger economy? This is World Cup time. We're all mad. This is the thing, you see. So I'm being a bit mad myself tonight. And, of course, we're all crazily optimistic. So you will find there'll be moments of deep, dark pessimism during this talk, but it's going to finish on a wildly optimistic note, I hope. So we're allowed to do this because it's the mood of the country. I, of course, have another theory. It might be because you've come along out of some sort of a morbid curiosity of what it's like to hear a university professor talk about something they know nothing about. And so that's true. I'm used to saying things about topics I know nothing about, and I clearly know nothing about economics. So what can a scientist say about that? And I'll have a go, and you can form your own judgment. But to start with, I'd like to say a little bit about scientists as a breed, and particularly New Zealand scientists, and perhaps a little an insight into the thinking of scientists, so it'll help you understand some of the strange things I'm about to tell you. Of course, we know these famous scientists, our two most famous scientists, Ernest Rutherford and Alan MacDiarmid, and they represent what I call phase one of New Zealand science. You want to be a scientist? Get the hell out of the place, right? Go off and don't come back, because you cannot do international science based here. Of course, it's not true. There were people doing science in New Zealand, but to be part of that international community in those days, you know, when it was ship travel, you couldn't do it from here. And something happened to me in 1970. I saw something remarkable. I saw the first 747 aircraft. It was at Athens Airport, and it just blew me away. And I realised then the world was going to change forever for New Zealand, that it would be possible to travel from the Northern Hemisphere to New Zealand in 24 hours and not take 6 weeks on a boat. And so some of us were crazy enough to come back and try being scientists in New Zealand. And so this is what I call phase two. And these are some wonderful New Zealand scientists. The one in particular that I'd like to draw your attention to is the man in the black and white picture on the bottom left, a wonderful man called Dan Walls. He was one of the most brilliant physicists this country ever produced. He sadly died of cancer in 1999. And I thought, well, if Dan can do it, I'll have a go too. And there are many of us, and I'll say some more about some of the others there in a moment. But these were this was the generation. We've all got a bit of grey hair now, but we decided to come and try and be scientists, but do it from home. And we did the experiment, and it worked. If you look at publications coming out of New Zealand, if you measure the scientific output of New Zealand per capita, we are one of the highest in the OECD. And here's a great thing, we're better than Australia. Okay, World Cup time. We're better than the United States. In fact, we're better than heaps of places. And we actually improved a lot over a 5-year period, or 10-year period, from 1995 to 2006, and we improved more than the Australians did. So we actually do very well. We punch above our weight, as we say in scientific output. But therein lies a question, which I'll come back to. Now, let me give you a bit of an insight about the way scientists think. We are strange. We're different than other people in the way we look at the world. Carl Sagan referred to the demon-haunted world, the idea of science as being a candle in the dark, this idea that somehow the reason that science represents has dragged us out of the pit of despair with superstition and so forth, that the Enlightenment is really driven by science. Another view, one that I like, it resonates with me, is Lewis Wolpert's idea that science is a means of overcoming common sense. Most people say common sense is a good thing, But scientists have no time for common sense whatsoever. We don't believe in it, and if I say things that sound absurd to you tonight, it's because I don't have any common sense, and scientists actually reject it. It's common sense that the sun goes around the earth. I mean, you go have a look, it does it every day, right? It's common sense. It's wrong. That's the problem, and that's what science gives us another way of looking. The way I like to look at it is in terms of values, because every walk of life, every profession, if you like, has values associated with it. These are some of the values of science. The idea that we have an evidence base for decisions. The idea that we have peer review. We say, what do you think of our work? Criticise me. We know that nature is rational, but it is certainly not benign. It is not a nice, cuddly thing. And you can know from what happened in Christchurch that it can be extraordinarily cruel. We accept that in science. We know that about nature. It's not a sweet, warm, fuzzy thing at all. We are sceptical by nature. We're contrarian, and you'll see that in some of my opinions tonight. What numbers mean is terribly important, what they don't mean. Ideas in science are often complex, and we need to be able to express them clearly. And never fear knowledge. Never fear knowledge. It's always best to know. Those are some of the ways that we look at the world, and you might see some of those themes come through tonight. So I'd just like to take you through the way in which science has affected humanity in terms of how we all look at the world. When Galileo made that telescope, and he looked up there, and he saw the phases of the moon, he realised what the circulatory motion of the planetary system was, that the Earth was not at the centre of the planetary system. He nearly came to grief with the church over that. He saw the moons of Jupiter. He realised that things were not perfect, simple spheres out there. There were other things going on, that Jupiter had these little irregular moons that were going around it. And so we started to see the place of Earth in the cosmos in a very different way. The telescope, when turned the other way around, became a microscope. When Robert Hooke looked first under the microscope, he realised that the world of life that we as humans see around us was only a very small fraction of life. That under the microscope, you could realise that a vast proportion of life, in fact the greatest proportion of life, is very strange, and in most cases unicellular. Whole new life was discovered by looking down there. And Charles Darwin gave us a way of understanding how life came about through evolution and natural selection, something that's very hard to come to grips with as human beings because we have this 70 years and 10 approach to the world. But of course evolution requires not thousands of years, not millions of years, but literally thousands of millions of years. And of course people didn't know how old the Earth was. And it was our own Ernest Rutherford who, if you look at the $100 banknote, if you ever get one, tourists have them, but I never have them in my pocket. But, you know, there's a gold medal on there, that's his Nobel Prize. And there's a graph on there, that's the law of radioactive decay that he discovered, for which he got the Nobel Prize. And he looked at the isotopic content of the Earth's surface, knowing their rate of decay, and he worked out how old planet Earth was, and he came up to the astounding result that it was thousands of millions of years old. And we know that the planetary system that we live in is 4.6 billion years old. Every technique comes up with the same answer. And of course that's the connection back with why life was able to evolve here at such a period. And then when Rosalind Franklin took this remarkable photograph, and in my view, that photograph in the top middle is the most important photograph of the 20th century. It's the X-ray diffraction photograph of DNA, from which Crick and Watson and Franklin and Wilkins, another New Zealander, were able to work out the structure of DNA, the molecule of life, the thing that drives all of life, and that those genes that are expressed in the DNA control life through their devices, which are the proteins that they make. And the protein structure discovered first by Dorothy Hodgkin has given us this insight. So we see the molecular basis of life, and all of Darwin's ideas suddenly become clear as to how this works, and it's an extraordinarily beautiful story. And here's another great New Zealander, Alan Wilson. He was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And he realised there were two types of DNA in our body. There's the DNA of the cell nuclei that we get half from our father and half from our mother. But there's another DNA in the mitochondria, the little energy sources in our cells, an ancient bacteria that incorporated themselves into eukaryotic systems. And that comes only from our mother, because sperm don't have mitochondria, but ovum do. And only from our grandmothers, and only from our great-grandmothers. And so they don't change. They only change through mutations. So if you look at two human beings on the planet and look at any differences through their DNA, of the DNA in their mitochondria, it can only have come about through the time that took place from the junction point of their common heritage. And we look at all of humanity, we find we go back to a common female ancestor probably about 150,000 years ago. And that all of humanity is connected. We know where Polynesians came from. We know from mitochondrial DNA the connectedness of the human race. We are all one family. We are very, very closely related. It's a wonderful story. That's what science tells us. And the modern version of Galileo is to look out there with a Hubble telescope. Here we see in the Eagle Nebula, 7,000 light years from Earth. It took 7,000 years for that light to get here. Great clouds of hydrogen where stars are being formed. We can see the birth of stars. And in this picture here, which is the most extraordinary picture of the Hubble telescope, you'll see galaxies so distant it's unimaginable. And you see a little square there in that picture, and it's blown up and it's blown up again. And that object is the most distant object that we have ever seen. The light from that object took 3.2 thousand million years to get to us on Earth. We are looking at something that existed 13.2 billion years ago. The age of the universe is only 13.6 billion years. We can look right back to the origin near the Big Bang with that. This is where science has taken us. It changes the way we think. And these are some of the things I spoke with Kim Hill about on radio, and we produced this book together. And I'm not trying to advertise the book, but I'm just telling you that it's an interest of mine too, that scientists get carried up in these big picture questions, and they're just wonderful and they're very exciting. But that's not what I've come here to talk to you about tonight. I want to talk to you about phase 3 of New Zealand science, because I've told you the cultural value of science, but somebody pays for science. A taxpayer pays for science, mostly in New Zealand. And so we have to ask the question, what impact does it make in our country? How can we as scientists contribute? And of course, Peter Gluckman, who you will all know well as the Prime Minister's Chief Scientific Advisor, has an amazing impact since he's had that role, bringing science to the attention of government, and he's done a fantastic job. I'll just mention a couple of others. Margaret Brimble, who is a wonderful organic chemist developing new synthetic routes to drugs, new antibiotics potentially, that could have great value for New Zealand in the future. And Peter Hunter, up on the top left there, who runs this extraordinary institute, the Physiome Project, and he's got 150 scientists working, and that's funded almost entirely from money coming from outside New Zealand investing in that science. We're not paying for it. The rest of the world is, because it's so good. And that organisation spun out many companies that are employing scientists. This is where science is going in New Zealand, the contribution. Of course, we know that science has been important to New Zealand as a society in the economy, because we look at our agriculture. And I've got a list there of things: breeding, fertilisers, top dressing, the electric fence. All these things came out of the engineering and science knowledge of New Zealanders that gave us an edge over the rest of the world and have made agriculture so successful. The breeding particularly. People like Francis Dry and Geoffrey Perrin, who have breeds of sheep named after them. I'm a physicist. I don't contribute to agriculture, but I want to ask the same question of myself. What can I do? What can people who work in these areas do to contribute to New Zealand's economy? And one of the reasons I'm talking to you tonight about this topic is that I got involved almost accidentally, because with some wonderful colleagues and friends of mine, we set up a company. And again, I'm not trying to sell you anything, because we don't sell anything to New Zealanders. We only sell abroad, because we're an export company selling high-tech products to the world. And that's what Magritech does. And it's the start of something new and very exciting in this country. And it's employing brilliant young scientists. And when I see them doing that, I get excited. And I see other people wanting to come from the rest of the world to work in that organisation. I think, wow, this is great. But you know, I go to Cambridge University, I go to New York University, whatever. What do I find? Everywhere in the world I find brilliant New Zealanders working in science elsewhere. And they don't know that it's possible to do great things back home. And that's part of the story I want to tell. And so that's why I wrote Walter Wetter. I got involved in how does New Zealand's economy develop using knowledge? Wetter we all heard about. And it's wonderful software, it's wonderful creative design, it's connected with the Jackson movie industry, so important for the city. And I have a particular regard for that company, which I'll again refer to later. So this is the story I want to tell you, and it's a story we all know as New Zealanders. It's the story of my lifetime. And if you're old enough, you will know that New Zealand was once more prosperous than Australia. It's absurd to say it, isn't it? But we kind of felt sorry for Australians when I was a kid. their per capita GDP was less than ours. The Australian dollar was rubbish. It was way less value than the New Zealand dollar. And more Australians migrated to New Zealand than vice versa. Now, a great gap has opened up. And you see that somehow there's a relative decline. Now, this is GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita. It's a measure of prosperity, and I'll try to justify that idea of measuring prosperity and well-being in a moment. So you'll bear with me. That's based on an average of 100 for the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. And here we are from 1970 to 2010. You see the gap there, which is very big now. And the government has set a goal to try to match Australia's per capita GDP, and I admire that. I think that's a worthy goal. We have to know why we want to grow prosperity. We have to have a reason to want to do it. And we have to have a mechanism for doing it. And that's where we're all a little bit puzzled and scratching our heads. And so I've been reading books on economics. And I've had some help from economist friends of mine. They said, Paul, you need to go and read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. So Adam Smith understood why the world became prosperous. Once when we were hunter-gatherers, we were all generalists. We all had to know how to hunt, how to gather the berries, how to light a fire and do that. But suddenly something happened with industrialisation where people started to specialise. And so one person would do one task and other people would do other tasks. And that created enormous efficiency gains and it grew wealth in countries. And the way that that worked to allow that specialisation required markets. And markets are based on the idea of trading. And you can only do that if you have property rights. And you can only do that if you have legal frameworks that protect those property rights. There has to be a work ethic around that. I think we've always had that as human beings. And a lack of corruption to make it work effectively. And that's fundamentally the necessary condition for prosperity. If you don't have that, you can't be. And that's why some of the world, which is rich in resources, and much of Africa is like this, doesn't seem to manage that. And countries like Switzerland or Japan, who have no resources at all, are incredibly wealthy, because that's the foundation. And here we excel in this in New Zealand. And I want to talk about this, because we had a commission that was set up to look at how we could grow prosperity. It was called the 2025 Task Force. It was headed by a very clever man, Dr. Don Brash. And Don has presented this argument, and here just a week ago he said, I believe the single biggest hurdle facing New Zealand's economic future is creeping erosion of property rights. So he says we're not doing enough Adam Smith, we haven't got it right. And I just want to look at this from an evidence base. You see there are outfits that measure property rights. And this one's called the Americans for Tax Reform Foundation Property Rights Alliance. Sounds pretty respectable, doesn't it? You know that we are 7th in the world in property rights. We are ahead of Australia. Whoa! We're ahead of the United States. We have fabulous property rights. We're apparently not as good as the Netherlands, but, you know, we're up there with the top countries. So we seem to have property rights already. So what's our political and legal rights like? Number 2 in the world, apparently. Number 2 in the world in legal and political rights. Well, what about corruption? We're number 1. That's to say we are the least corrupt country in the world, and we come out in that every single year, the least corrupt country. I'm only telling you things you already know about New Zealand. We're not corrupt people, are we? But that's what we are. You know, Adam Smith would be celebrating us now, wouldn't he? He'd think we're pretty good. Well, maybe we're overtaxed. You hear that, don't you? You've heard that? We're overtaxed? Well, let me tell you something. We have the 3rd lowest tax rate in the whole OECD. The 3rd lowest. There's our green is income tax, and the purple is company tax. And by the way, next month, company tax drops to there. Again, we're lower than Australia. We're lower than the United States by a long way. We have one of the lowest taxation rates that is around. I'm not talking about countries that are dirt poor. I'm talking about the OECD countries. You may say, well, yeah, but how do you measure taxes? You know, because some people pay health insurance and stuff. Okay, let's do it whatever way you like. The difference between what the employer pays you and what you get in your pocket, we are 3rd to lowest. There's Mexico and Chile are only the least. We don't have all these clever things. We just pay tax. We don't pay national health insurance or whatever, you know, as part of our taxation. We do this a very simple way. So, you know, we're very low tax. So when I hear this stuff in 2025, who just say, you've got to cut taxes, you need better property rights, I'm saying, I'm sorry, we already did it. And that's obviously not what it's about. That is what's known as the New Zealand paradox. It's called, people in the rest of the world refer to New Zealand as the economists as the New Zealand paradox. We have fantastic Adam Smith credentials, but somehow or other our economic performance has been poor. And I want to come back to that because it actually isn't quite as poor as you might imagine, and I want to show you that. But here's the point, there's something else missing here. And there are other economists who say, yes, that's a necessary condition for prosperity, but it's not sufficient. You've got to do something else in the modern world. You have to innovate. Now, here's a book, The Play on the Wealth of Nations, by David Landis, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. And Landis tells the story about Nathan Rothschild. Nathan Rothschild, when this portrait was painted in 1821, was the richest man in the world. And in 1836, he died because he got a scratch, and it got infected, and he died of septicemia. The richest man in the world died of septicemia. Nobody in the world today, no matter how poor, should die of that if they can get an antibiotic. They can get to a doctor or a hospital, even in the most desperately poor countries, if you can get an antibiotic. So there's a sense in which the richest man alive in 1821 is poorer than some of the poorest who are alive today. In other words, we have really gained, all of us on the planet, apart from those in desperate situations in Somalia or somewhere like that at the moment. Even in their present situation, we live better in many ways than people who were very rich did earlier on. And so that's what innovation does. That's what knowledge does. It changes the way we live. So I want to come back to this graph now, and instead of plotting it in terms of how we compare with the OECD, I want to plot it in absolute terms. And let's go right back to New Zealand's history. Now, there's a lot of graphs there, and I want to unravel them for you. But let me just note there's a few countries here, and I want to show you this one. This is Japan. What happened there? Oh dear, there was a war. Wars are very bad for prosperity. And we all know that, right? But look what happened after the war. Now, this is a log graph. It means that on a graph like that, a fixed growth rate would be a straight line. And you see, suddenly the growth rate of Japan dramatically increased until it got up to the rest of the world, and then it kind of slowed down. If you're behind, it's easy to grow. Look, the Netherlands got knocked around in the war. They grew back very rapidly as well. That's the first point I want to make. Here's a graph that shows growth rates of economies over the period from 1950 to 1980, depending on GDP per capita in 1950. So the lower your GDP per capita just after the war, the faster you grew. Look at that graph. It's amazing. The richer you were, the slower you grew. If you're behind, it's easy to get ahead. Great. First optimistic thing. We're behind. We can get ahead. All right? Got me. Okay. So now, let's strip away some of those things. Let's look at a few countries. Here's New Zealand. Let's look at us. We start farming. Wow, we're doing really well. We've got Britain as a market. You know, we're really prosperous compared with other countries. Here's our growth rate. Doesn't really change. The rest of the world starts to increase. But we don't. Until something happens here. And you can see from there on, we've grown at the same rate as the rest of the world. Okay, Australia's done a little better, but by and large, it's just that we did something too late, and we're growing again, we're growing like the rest of the world, but we've got a gap that's opened up, and we need to close it. So what happened? And I'm going to be controversial. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say what I think happened. Was it Britain going into the common market that caused our problem? No. We were in decline before that. It just didn't help. It maybe even sent it down slightly. But it wasn't some dramatic thing. We were in decline for a long, long time because we weren't innovating. We had a very protected economy. I know people say rude things about the reforms that happened in 1984 to 1990, but I believe they transformed New Zealand into a market economy. They got one of the Adam Smith fundamentals right. It took some time. It was damn painful. But after a little while, we started to pick up, and off we went. And there we're going. We have got a very fine basis for growth. That is my reading as a scientist, not being an expert on economics, and I don't want to be political about this, but I do believe we've got a benefit from it. So let me tell you a little bit about my summary of New Zealand, and then we'll get into some of the problems and how we can deal with them. This is from Time magazine. You won't be able to read that thing. It's just to prove that I got it out of Time magazine, so you get some evidence. But here's some things. Look, income inequality. We're 26 out of 33. That's at the bad end. We've got very high income inequality. We know about child poverty in this country. We've had a gap opened up between the rich and the poor, which is one of the biggest gaps in the OECD. That's something that's very surprising to many New Zealanders. You see that reflected in many negative social indicators, whether it's obesity or child mortality, teenage pregnancy, or imprisonment rates. There we are, imprisonment. We've got one of the highest incarceration rates in the OECD, very high level of incarceration, near the bottom in terms of that negative indicator. But there are some good things as well. Our level of democracy is very high on this measure. We got number 2, I think, on the other one I showed you, but we know that's good. And here's a fascinating thing. In maths and science and in reading, we are really, really good. Our kids are well educated. And I'll come back to that point because it's a very important one for us. But I believe what holds us back is not our incapacity through some fundamental problem. We've got everything, all the fundamentals are there. We've got a great education system. It's simply, in my view, because we're not thinking to do the right things. And that's the argument I want to put to you tonight. And part of it is that we wallow in a mythology that makes us feel good about ourselves, but much of which is fundamentally untrue. And some of the things I'm going to tell you will offend. In fact, I will be disappointed if people are not offended by some of the things I say. But at different times, I'll probably offend different people. So and it means in the end, I'll have offended you all. But I don't mind, and I'm going to have a go. But you see, here's the first one, clean and green. Well, you know, the rest of the world doesn't buy it. We can tell ourselves that. But you can read what the rest of the world says, and they don't believe it. And some of you may have seen John Key interviewed by the BBC on Hard Talk. And it was, you know, I felt sorry for him. You know, they were showing him our rivers were dirtier than German rivers and things like that. We have a problem, and we need to face up to it. We have a serious problem. Our dairying, which is a fabulous industry, which I adore and which I will explain as being important, so important to New Zealand, we've got to protect it and look after it, has a huge impact on our rivers. Our environmental indices have been dropping in the last few years, so the rest of the world's noticing that we're performing more poorly. We have a real problem with water quality, and this has been pointed out to us. We have in this country a capacity for what I call egregious hypocrisy. I think we do hypocrisy almost better than anyone, and I want to tell you why. For all our environmental problems, we just love telling the rest of the world what terrible people they are. We tell Indonesians they shouldn't chop down their rainforests, and we shouldn't allow products in that have got anything to do with palm oil, because you know it's awful what they do to their rainforests, so they're planting these palm trees, and the orangutans having a rough time, and you know we shouldn't do it. Excuse me, what did we do? We turned 2/3 of our native forest into greenhouse gas, and we didn't put palm oil trees, we put grass. And on the grass, we put ruminant animals to pump more greenhouse gas out, you know. And we wiped out hundreds of species of birds and other little creatures. And we lectured the rest of the world about what they should do. Should we not have done this? How else would we have had any prosperity at all had we not developed farming? Of course, we had no choice. And poor countries do have no choice but to use their resources. And when we are relatively rich as we are, it is almost obscene for us to talk to a poorer country and say, you should not burn your coal, you should not cut down your trees, because they look at us and they say, bloody hypocrites. And that's what we are. We need to grow up about this. Of course, there is a moral position to be taken here. If we don't like that they cut down their trees, we know what to do. Buy the forests at market values, put a covenant on, and donate them back as national parks. That would be a decent, honourable thing to do. But not to say we discriminate against your products because you're doing what we did 100 years ago. That's outrageous. That's my view. Second, our journalists, I apologise to those who've heard this joke before, but I'm hoping some of you haven't heard this. I love telling this joke. It's all about this boat. It's called the AD Gill. It had a little accident with a whaling boat in the Southern Ocean, I should say, last year. We all got very sentimental about it. Poor old Pete Bethune and all that stuff. And it used to be known as the Earth Race Eco Boat. Wonderful thing, an eco boat, you see. And here's a lovely story written in the Herald, every little drop helps the planet. Well, I was astounded when I read that, because I'm a physicist, and physicists and engineers have all heard of the eco boat. It's really famous to us, because most of us have read a book by this really well-known Cambridge professor. You won't be able to read that graph, but it's called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. And it's all about vehicles. And you see on this graph here is how much fuel is needed per passenger kilometre of a vehicle. And here's how fast a vehicle goes. So bicycles are just the best. And Celia's here tonight, and she'll agree with me. Bicycles are great. Very little fuel, but they're not so fast. But if you fill electric trains with people, not in Auckland, hopefully, but yeah, that's even better, right? Now, our trains run well. So there we are. That's even better because it's also efficient, but it's much faster. Then we come to really bad things like buses, not so good. Boeing 747s are not good. Cars are not good. Ocean liners are bad. There's jet skis. Don't we hate jet skis? Aren't they the worst? No, sorry. I've got one worse for you. You got it. It's the Earth Race Eco Boat. It is the greatest gas guzzler ever made, ever designed by humanity. And when the Shona Maru chopped its bow off and sent it to Davy Jones' locker, it did a magnificent service to the world environmental movement. Now, isn't that a fabulous story? Didn't you love that story? And what journalist has written that story? Our journalists just, oh no, every little drop saves the planet, blah, blah, blah. You know, we just tell ourselves this crap, don't we? We love it. But I'm sorry, I'm a scientist, I'm mean and picky, and but it's fun too, isn't it? Anyway, I want to show you something else. Now, I know I'm going to offend Wellingtonians here. This is a picture of me. This is an X-ray CT with positron emission tomography in it. And what you do is you feed into the blood vein radioactively labelled glucose, fluorine-18 labelled glucose, and if you've got cancer cells, they love glucose because they've really got a high metabolic rate. So does your tongue and your brain and so forth. But you can recognise the tongue and the brain. But if you get a nice glowing spot somewhere where you haven't got a tongue or a brain or a kidney, you know you've got a tumour. And that's my tumour right there. Big one. Big one. Wow. That's not very good, is it? Well, that's me. That's the way it was. I'm very glad to have found it. I found a lot of other tumours as well. Now, where's that radioactive material made? Just over by the airport, folks. Did you know about that? You won't find a sign. They're not advertising it. There's a 16 million electron volt accelerator there. By nuclear reactions, it creates this radioactive material, and it sends it around the hospitals in New Zealand that need that. And just a little distance away, a few hundred metres, is this sign. Welcome to Wellington, capital of nuclear-free New Zealand. Don't we do the crap? Don't we do the crap well in this country, eh? Oh, but look, that's okay. Look, it's for medical use. It's all right. And anyway, it's only got a half-life of, 100 minutes, so that's not so bad. Wait a minute. Anyone got one of those in their house? I hope so. It's got americium-241 in there. The half-life of that radioactive isotope is 432 years, and it's made from plutonium in nuclear reactors in the Northern Hemisphere. Well, we're anti-nuclear, but we're happy to have your stuff made in your reactors. Ship it here. We won't say anything about it. We'll detect smoke and we'll save lives with it. You see, it's hypocrisy, isn't it? And our objection to this is really a spiritual one, and I don't mind that, but let's be honest about it. You see, here's an example, and if I haven't offended any of you yet, I'm going to get the last of you now. There is no evidence that genetically modified organisms or food have any problem whatsoever. There is no scientific evidence you can find. No, we have a spiritual objection to it. We don't like G because it's spiritually. No problem with that at all. I'm not anti-religion. I'm not at all. However, if the Australians have a spiritual objection to our apples, which apparently they do, we go running off the World Trade Organization. The science. There's no scientific evidence whatsoever there's any problem with fire blight at all. So we play the game when it suits us, but when it doesn't, we do the spiritual thing. I don't mind. Just get consistent, will you please? That's all I'm saying. This is adolescent behaviour. Kids can do that, but adults can't. And I think that's part of the problem, because until we're honest about ourselves, how can we face up to child poverty? How can we face up to the issues that are really important in this country until we start to be honest? And that's all I'm asking. And that's really part of the point. By the way, a happy story. That was me 4 months later after a course, 4 cycles of Avastin, irinotecan, capecitabine. Didn't get rid of the cancer, but, got a bit smaller. And therein lies something very interesting, because this was a key drug. This is a monoclonal antibody, very, very sophisticated. You can't get that in the health system in New Zealand. Why? You can get it in Australia, free. Canada, free. New Zealand, sorry, we can't afford it. I paid $28,000 for that. Wasn't I lucky? Don't want to be poor if you've got cancer in New Zealand. Does prosperity matter? I make no apology whatever for saying that, in my view, and I feel passionately about that, prosperity matters to New Zealanders. It matters in our health system. We can't do the things we want to do. We can't get the child cancer specialists in Wellington because we can't pay the salaries we need for consultants. We can't have the drugs we want. And if you've got someone in your family, you've got a child in your family who's suffering from cancer, let me tell you, you care about prosperity. And I'm proud of our health system. It's wonderful, and I know how stretched they are, and I applaud them. But they need more resources. We've got a very limited infrastructure. Poor old Aucklanders can't even make their trains run properly. Oh, did I say that before? Sorry. Anyway, we got problems, haven't we? It's shameful. We kind of get embarrassed. We just haven't spent on it. Look at what we had to do in Wellington. We waited years and years and years, and we're still trying to sort this problem out. It's embarrassing. Anyone who travels, I've just been to Beijing. Oh my goodness, what are you going to travel the underground railway there? I'm not saying we want to live like the Chinese, but boy, it runs beautifully, and it's gorgeous high tech and so forth. Prosperity matters. And here's the thing that has really driven it home to us. The Christchurch is a game changer for New Zealand. The effect of Christchurch is traumatic for us. The loss of life was just terrible, and the grief that those families feel is really something. But the effect on our economy, which affects all of us in New Zealand, is dramatic. It is 2 or maybe 3 times the effect on our economy that Japan's Sendai earthquake and tsunami is on theirs. We are going to be paying for this for a generation. There are great opportunities around what we will do with Christchurch, but boy, prosperity matters. We're going to need all the wherewithal we can to rebuild that. That's important to us. Now, there will still be some of you who say, isn't happiness more important than prosperity? It is. And if you get more prosperous, don't you just damage the environment more? Actually, no. Here's some evidence. There's a lot of studies been done on different measures in the world. If you're really poor, you don't do much to your environment. You live in balance. If you're a hunter-gatherer, and there's a few of you, it's okay. As you start to grow and industrialise, you do. New Zealand pillaged its environment when it was very poor in order to get farming going. But once you start to go on the other side of the curve, the more prosperous you get, the more you can protect the environment. And Zealandia, this wonderful facility we have in Wellington, which is a biodiversity protection project, costs money. And we can't do that unless we have a prosperity. Here's what we could do if we were rich. We could get rid of every damn possum and mustelid in the whole of New Zealand. We could do it. It's been costed for Stewart Island. It would cost $50 million. It is possible to get rid of all the possums in New Zealand if we had the wherewithal. That's what prosperity makes possible. You don't have to have gold-plated taps. You can do good things, and you can protect your environment. So I feel passionately that growing prosperity, if you're wise, enables you to do good things to the environment. And here's another thing. Doesn't it create more income disparity to get richer? Strangely, the evidence suggests otherwise. That's data. Each dot there's a country in the world. And as you grow per capita GDP, there's kind of an inverted U. And as you get more and more prosperous, you get to the Switzerlands and the Swedens compared with, say, the Chinas and the Mexicos. So if you're in the sort of middle area and you're not so well off, you have big income disparities. But as you get more prosperous and you're wise, you may be like the United States where they're rich but have a very big income disparity. But you can be wise and you can reach that gap and you can do more. And that's, again, I don't think that income disparity is something that follows prosperity. So let me come to the third problem with New Zealand. Well, look, I know that we have problems, but at least this is a nice country to live because we don't have to work too hard and we can all go off to the beach and it's a jolly nice lifestyle. Well, let me tell you something surprising. You won't be able to see New Zealand on that graph. You've got to guess where it is, and I'll show you in a minute. Here is how hard people work. How many hours work per capita? 100 is the OECD average. And this is how much is made per hour, how much your productivity is. You see, the French don't work at all. Actually, not true. It says 70%. They only work 70%, but they work the least. Look at their productivity. It's fabulous. Isn't it great? Better than the United States. Now, this is 2005 data, and things have changed a little bit. I've seen the 2008 data. I haven't updated the slide. But what's happened to New Zealand hasn't changed at all. That's us. Well, at least we're not the hardest working country in the OECD. At least the Icelanders work harder than us. I have no idea what they do in Iceland. But they do work harder than us. So the idea that we have a nice, easy lifestyle, forget it. In fact, we all know why New Zealanders get jobs and they go overseas, because people know they're well-educated and they're bloody hard-working. They are. We are hard-working. But look at our productivity. Greece has passed us by. You know what's happened in the last few years? New Zealand's moved even further back. We are. Now, I am lying. I'm misleading because there's 2 OECD countries I've failed to put on the graph. There are 2 countries with productivity lower than New Zealand, Turkey and Mexico. Isn't that great? Well, so that's our problem. We have low productivity. And I believe, and as a personal belief of mine, that that is a choice we have made. We are poor because we choose to be poor. Now, I do not mean that in an offensive way to say that any individual is poor, they're the architect of their own misfortune. I mean, we as a nation, me, you, all of us, have chosen to work in low-income activities, generally speaking. We don't have to do that. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But that's the basic problem. It's productivity, and that's what we've got to get up. So let me come back to this graph here, and let's see how big that gap is. Because I want to put a number on there. The gap between us and Australia, I'm not saying we have to be like the Australians, but if we take that as a goal, that would, if we were as well off as Australia, we'd be pretty well off. We could definitely kill all the possums and mustelids. $40 billion US, about 45 billion New Zealand. I'll say roughly, let's say $40 billion a year. That's how much more we have to earn, and ideally through exports. So just remember that figure, 40 billion. Okay? Now, you know, I know the answer to that. People positively Wellington Tourism will tell you the answer to that. We just need more tourists. Have we got it? Well, let me tell you how much tourism earns per year. It's about $8 billion a year. So we need about 5 times as many tourists. That would be great. It'd be good to have 5 times as many tourists in Wellington. We got that with the Rugby World Cup. But, you know, if you do the Tongariro crossing, instead of having 600 people do it a day, which is the current rate on a good day, you'd have 3,000. That'd be good. Or for South Islanders here, instead of having 10,000 people visit Milford Sound every week, you have 50,000. Right? Great. We've got it solved. So that's the answer. We can all go home now or pack up. There's something I want to tell you. Our per capita GDP in New Zealand is about $40,000 a year. And how many jobs are there in New Zealand? Full-time equivalent jobs. There's 1.3 million jobs in New Zealand, full-time equivalent. So if you do the sums, it means that the amount you need to earn per job to have our current per capita GDP is 120,000. Don't get excited. That's not what the employees get paid. That's what the business has got to earn per job. And what does tourism earn? 80,000 a job. What does that mean? The more you expand tourism, the poorer you get. Now, this is obviously, what I'm telling you is obviously insane. There's something not right here, is there? I mean, surely tourism is good. It's great. And the reason it's great is it employs unskilled people. And that's why every country in the world benefits from tourism. It's basically bus driving and bed making. Now, that's not in a derogatory statement. That's a worthwhile thing, and it's a wonderful thing to work in the tourist business. But you don't need a university degree, frankly, and you don't need to be an expert welder or something like that, or know how to do, you know, electronic printed circuit boards. So it's a low-wage activity. Wine is $90,000 a job. Again, by expanding the wine industry, we cannot grow prosperity. The reason we have tourism is that it provides employment and it projects us to the world. It shows the rest of the world who we are, and it's part of our values, and we do it very well, and it's important to New Zealand. And the wine industry tells the world how sophisticated we are, and it gives us a wonderful quality of life, and I'm immensely proud of our wines, as I'm sure you all are too. But let's understand why they're good for us. It's not because more wine makes us more prosperous. It makes us less prosperous. So how do we have any prosperity at all? Food manufacturing, which is big in New Zealand, comes in just on the average. The rest of manufacturing is quite a bit higher, but there is one business in New Zealand that's dramatically productive, and it's called the dairy industry. And the dairy industry brings in about $350,000 a job. Now, by the way, these are my figures, but I had Phil O'Reilly at Business New Zealand get his economists to check them over. They basically agree. There's the amount of employment there, so I've represented the total contribution to the economy by the area. So really we should drop to our knees every morning and, you know, praise the Almighty for the existence of Fonterra, because without dairy, New Zealand would be desperately poor. And so we come to another solution, which is to grow dairy. And dairy brings in about 10 billion a year, so we need 4 times as many cows. And immediately you're thinking, wait a minute, 4 times as many cows? What the heck are we going to do? Where are we going to put them? And what's it going to do to our rivers? And you would be right, because we have reached the limits for dairy. We can't take any more. Our water quality and our water sources are under stress. We can't grow that. And so suddenly we've become a country not like we've been for 150 years. We've become a country like Singapore or Japan or Switzerland without resources, where we have to, if we're to grow prosperity, start to do things with our brains, because we can't keep on pillaging the resources. We can't keep on taking stuff out of the land, because if we do, we'll destroy what we value in New Zealand. So I made some fun about environmentalism, but I'm going to assert a very strong green environmental theme here, which will come through in a moment. But there is another company I want to draw your attention to. It's only small, it's only 500 million a year, not 10 billion a year, but there's a few of those companies, and look at its productivity. It's almost up there with Fonterra. And there's no limit to the number of companies like that we can have. Very important idea. We think $350,000 a job is great. Here's a table of jobs. I don't expect you to read it, but that's in US dollars. Apple Computer, $1.3 million US a job. Google, $1 million a job. Samsung, $1 million US a job. That's what goes on in the world out there. We don't have any businesses like that in New Zealand. There is a level of productivity that exists in the world in things like the pharmaceutical industry, in high-tech manufacturing on a large scale, which produce spectacular productivity. And here we have McDonald's, great company, $73,000 a job. New Zealand runs a McDonald's economy. We choose to work in low-income activities. We should be working in those sorts of activities instead of working in those. So that's the point. Now, you'll be thinking, well, look, this all sounds great, but you couldn't make computers in New Zealand. You'd probably be right. And you can't manufacture in New Zealand because you can't compete with the Chinese. They're so efficient and they're so cheap, their wages, you can't manufacture. The biggest single component of exports in the New Zealand economy, 2010, is manufacturing. It is bigger than dairy. It is way bigger than meat. It is bigger than tourism. That's the biggest single component of New Zealand's economy in exports is manufacturing. And a large proportion of that is what's known as elaborately transformed manufacturing. A lot of it goes to Australia because of CER and to the rest of the world. And some of it is invisible to New Zealand for some very interesting reasons. But we can manufacture. All you have to do is make sure that the product has a very high value and a high profit margin, a very high knowledge content, in other words. And there are varying degrees of knowledge content. You can make garden furniture, which is good. You can make electric fences. You can make crystal-controlled oscillators. You can make nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometers. There's a whole value chain there. And the further you go up that value chain, the more you can manufacture in New Zealand. It's very interesting. But what drives that is knowledge. And the fundamental basis of innovation, because what I'm talking here is an economy based on innovation, is really about research and development. What you pay for in those products is not the manufacturing cost. In Magritech, I think, as I recall, our manufacturing costs are about 1/4 of our sales price. 3/4 of our sales price was the R&D that we had to do to make that product. It's the brain work. And so R&D is the furnace that feeds this. And this is where we do very poorly in New Zealand. Our rate of investment as a fraction of GDP is one of the lowest in the OECD. Both government, black, and industrial private investment, way less than the OECD average. We're about 0.5% GDP. It's represents about $800 million a year of government spending. Now, I'm not saying more government money would solve this problem. It might send a signal that it's important, but this is not a clamour for more government money. Really what we need is more investment from business. And part of the problem is that it reflects the nature of business. I mean, if you're exporting milk powder, you don't need a lot of R&D. And so that's why we are as we are. It's not that industry is bad and they need to have a kick up the pants. It just reflects the fact that our economy doesn't have enough of that knowledge-based component in it. How do we get out of that vicious cycle? How do we encourage industry to invest more? That's the political question, which I'll leave to the politicians. But it is important to us. That's the point I want to make. And the other problem is we have a terrible, terrible difficulty in New Zealand. We screw up, I think, so often. And it's because we get into sloppy thinking. And here's a little argument I'll make, and you'll hear it from various people. New Zealand is very small. True. Therefore, we can't do everything. True. So we have to specialise. Now I'm terrified. What the hell are we going to specialise in? Oh, you'll get the answer. We've got to play to our strengths. Play to our strengths. What are we good at? Well, we're good at farming, and we're clean and green and things like that. So we'll do, what could we add to farm? We could do biotechnology. We tried that for 10 years. That was our proportion of investment in biotechnology. That's the United States' proportion, France, Britain, Korea, you name it. But we went for it big time. And it turned out that it didn't produce much of an outcome. And it wasn't the fault of anyone in that community. It's just that it's really hard to get biotechnology to go, because if you're making new products for medicine, for example, like drugs and so forth, you need to do big trials, and it's very expensive, and there's a lot of investment, and we didn't have the source of investment capital and so on. We've got another one now. You hear politicians talk about clean tech. We should do clean tech. That's like windmills. We're going to be better at making windmills than the rest of the world. Why? Because we're clean and green. So we should want to, right? Or maybe it's smart foods. We'll make smart foods. Now, the problem with this is that I'm one of those pesky scientists. I like to go to the lab and do a measurement. So I'll ask, what are we good at in New Zealand? And that's the list. You won't be able to read that, but it's, you know, if you go to Statistics New Zealand, they won't be able to tell you the answer to that because they don't measure this. It takes a private company to measure what we're producing in the knowledge sector, and it's called the TIN 100, Technology Investment Network 100. You have to pay $250 a report, produced by a wonderful man called Greg Callaghan, and that's his business. And he analyses that part of the New Zealand economy, from the biggest down to the smallest. There's the top 100 companies in the knowledge sector. And the two green bars there are the only two biotech companies. New Zealand Pharmaceuticals and Douglas Pharmaceuticals. The rest are weird. They're making crystal control oscillators for GPS and mobile handsets. They're making respiratory humidifiers and sleep apnea devices. They're doing digital special effects for movies. Well, we've all heard of that one. That's what they're doing. And who would have guessed that we'd do those things? Well, it's not so surprising when you think about it, because I come back to these two guys that I started with. Why did we produce, as our two greatest scientists, a nuclear physicist and a polymer chemist? Surely we should have produced an earthquake scientist and a plant scientist. I haven't the faintest idea why. That's just the way it is. It just happened to be the quirky little place we are. We throw up these weird things that we're good at. It's just the way it is. So what I say is we will be good at what we are good at. And we should not be prescriptive. We should not think we should put our eggs in clean tech or put our eggs in biotech. We should put our eggs where the investors see good market opportunities. Because basically this is made by brilliant entrepreneurs. This is not about clever scientists. This is not about clever engineers. It's ultimately about brilliant business people. Because what you have to do here is to do something quite remarkable. You have to lever off the fact that we're a tiny country. And what that leads to is another paradox. And the paradox is this. These are some of our high-tech companies. If you want to be an investor in a high-tech company, ask them what they do. And if it sounds good, don't invest in that company. What do I mean by that? If it sounds good to you, it may sound pretty good to a lot of other people in the world, and the world's a lot bigger than us. We are not going to make computers. We are not going to make flat-screen television sets. We're going to do strange little niches. And here's where the advantage comes in. The advantage for New Zealand being so small, being 0.2% of the world's economy, is that the world's economy is 500 times bigger than us. And what that means is there are little pieces of it out there that are far too small for General Electric, Apple Computer or Samsung to even bother with. And you grab a piece of that, and you're so tiny, it can be really big for you. If you dominate the world market in respiratory humidifiers and sleep apnea devices, as Fisher & Paykel Healthcare does, you've got a $500 million a year export business employing 2,000 people. That's the name of the game. You've got to do weird. And you've got to find the niches, and that requires entrepreneurial genius and understanding of how to meld the technology and skill and engineering skills to that market opportunity that you've seen. And that's the genius that's needed. And that's really the challenge. But the great opportunity with these companies is they don't produce greenhouse gases. They don't put nitrates in our streams. They don't require energy. They don't require land. They don't dump mine tailings on our landscape. They are completely environmentally benign, and there is no limit to the number of companies like that you could have. But there is an issue around why you would have those companies that I'll come back to. Well, here's the thing. I couldn't get the information from Statistics New Zealand. They don't keep it. They'll give you stuff about how much jute we export, but they won't tell you about this. It says something about the thinking, doesn't it? But there's Greg Shanahan's data. Unfortunately, he's only got 5 years of it. That's our total exports. You can see that red line. Looks like it's climbing faster than the blue line. And it is. It's growing faster. Well, I'll tell you who does measure our high-tech exports, even though New Zealand government can't bother to measure it. The World Bank does. And they have a definition of high-tech, which is really super high-tech. It's ICT and pharmaceuticals and aerospace and so on. So it's a smaller part of than the 100 list is, but it goes for more years. And look at the slope of that. It's shooting up. It's kind of, there's a few ups and downs on the way. The average rate of growth of that super high-tech area for New Zealand, small as it is, only a few $100 million, is 11% per annum. And our economy's been growing at 3% per annum for a long, long time. That's what developed countries do. So it's getting bigger and bigger. It's happening. It's happening, people. Our kids don't know about it. Their parents don't know about it. But the people running these businesses know about it. And they're not telling you. And they're not telling you because they don't need to, because they don't sell a damn thing to New Zealanders. It's all sold offshore. It's invisible. And it's weird. So why would we know about it? Except for one, and that's wetter, because we all go to the movies. Now, here's another bit of science attack. My friend Sean Hendy, Professor Sean Hendy's done an analysis of that 10-100, and he's plotted it on a log graph of the probability of finding a company above a certain amount of export per year versus the number of companies, and it sort of goes into what's called a straight line. And when a physicist sees a straight line on a log graph, we get very excited. We say, it's a power law. You say, what does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. It means complexity, It means interconnectedness. It means ecosystem. That's what it means. It means self-organised criticality. It means you've got a complex, interconnected system. And I'll give you some examples. Earthquakes are like that. The whole of the Earth's crust interconnected. There's the graph for earthquakes. How many earthquakes do you have? What's the probability of an earthquake above a certain size? In Christchurch, they have lots and lots of earthquakes. Many smaller ones, fewer larger ones. There's a slope there. See, it's the same graph. This is tree diameters in a Colombian forest, rainforest, an ecosystem. What it's telling you is you can't have the big ones without the small ones. They know that in Christchurch. You get aftershocks. You can't have big trees without small ones as well. You can't have the big companies without the little ones. The whole thing's an ecosystem. We need more of these little companies feeding in, more startups. Don't just focus on the big companies, look at the whole thing. That's what the numbers tell us. They have profound insights as to how we grow it. And so the big companies are the ones that bring us a lot of money, and if we take the top 10 of them, it's $3.5 billion a year. And remember that figure I asked you to remember, 40 billion. We're after 40 billion. So instead of 10 of these companies, we need 120. Well, let's say 100. Now we've solved the problem for New Zealand. 10 of those, 100. 100 companies, not 10, let's have 100. If we had 100, we've bridged the gap. We've done nothing bad to our environment. And we've got something quite remarkable, which is sustainable for the future. And what does it take? It takes 100 brilliant entrepreneurs. We're a country of 5.4 million people. So wait a minute, I thought we were 4. No, there's 1 million livers overseas. I'll come to them in a minute. Okay. Can we find 100 people, please? I think we can. I know we can. But you know, our kids don't know about this because we're not telling them about it because these businesses are invisible. And I think this is the problem. If we started to think right, if we started to think, this is what we do in New Zealand. Clean and green, yes, that's why we love it here. We've got to do more of that. We've got to protect our environment more. But actually, we're smart. But then why would those businesses stay in New Zealand once they're successful? Fonterra's stuck here because the land's here. But why is Fisher & Paykel here? Why don't they move to San Diego or Shanghai? Why don't they move to Sydney? They'd be closer to their markets. And is it because there's more investment capital here? No. More R&D money available? No. More graduates from university? No. There is only one reason those companies can be here. The only one I can find, and tell me if there's another one. And that's it. It's because the people who are the creative engines of those companies love living in New Zealand. They say, stuff it, I don't want to live in Sydney. I want to live in New Zealand. And that's why they're here. And so the key to growing this sort of business is to make New Zealand a place where talent wants to live. And therein lies certain consequences. Because creative, talented people don't want to live in gated communities with poverty and crime on their doorsteps. They do care about the environment. We know this in our own company. We recruit brilliant people from Germany and the United States. They come here, they love trout fishing, they love mountain biking, they love the outdoors, they love New Zealand's environment, but they love the society as well. And if we don't get the importance of social justice, of good schools, of a decent health system, of safe streets, and a pristine environment, then we don't understand the business plan for New Zealand, because that's what it's got to be. And if you have that as your mission statement, there are certain consequences. I'll give you one example. Rodney High got terribly excited after earthquake. He said, look, we can do it now. We get away with it. Let's go and dig up all the national parks because we've got a crisis and they'll let us do it. And we can, we can get hundreds of billions of dollars. Well, he got a bit excited. It was about 60 billion altogether under the ground, maybe, somewhere. Maybe some of it's in the national parks. But if you have a business plan like the one I'm talking about, you're not interested in $60 billion at the cost of all you hold dear. You're after $40 billion a year, sustainably, for the future. And thank you. I don't wish, this is not about politics, and I've got nothing against people who have different economic theories, but it's just a business model. Because if we don't get it right, people won't want to live here. We won't attract our best and brightest home. We won't attract the clever and capable and talented people who want to come and live here. Now, there are challenges for us about if we grow prosperity, get that income disparity dealt with, and I want to say something about that in a moment. And I would be remiss with the Chancellor present and the Vice-Chancellor if I did not mention the essential role of universities in all this. Not just Victoria University, I might add, even Auckland University, perhaps even Otago University. They do. And you see, one of the things you find about these great innovation centres in the world, you go to Boston, you go to Raleigh-Durham, the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, you go to the San Francisco Bay Area, you go to Cambridge University, where I'm currently on leave at Trinity College, you see these giant science parks. The reason that it hums there is that people go to great universities. They love the experience, and they love the quality of life in those places, because Boston's a wonderful place to live, and so is the Bay Area. And they don't want to leave. They just stick around and they start companies. And there's this vibrancy about it, because universities create a kind of a life to a place, and they provide regional leadership. They act as a hub. They bring international people in. The movie industry does that too. So I'm not just claiming that, you know, the university does that. My cousin was in a bar the other night. She said, "That's Orlando Bloom over there." It was too. It was James Nesbitt. They're in the same, you know, this is Wellington. This is it. You know, we've got the Roxy Theatre. You know, I got a friend who lives in the Bay Area. He says there's nothing like Lighthouse, Petone or the Roxy anywhere in the whole San Francisco Bay Area. Nothing. We've got some fabulous things here. This is a place where talent wants to live. That's what makes Wellington a vibrant place we're so proud of. But universities are a part of that. Oh dear, that's some news from last week. You know, we've got to. I'm sorry, we need to look after our universities. That's really important. But there's something else as well. We have to take responsibility as scientists. I showed you a graph before that said our publication rate is one of the highest in the world. This is our patenting rate, one of the lowest. There is a culture problem in New Zealand science. We, the science community, have got a problem. Too many of us are stuck in phase 2. We're stuck where we're trying to get the best publications in the best journal to prove that we can do international science in New Zealand. Well, I'm sorry, we've already proven that. We've done that experiment. It's not even interesting. You can. What can we do to make science valuable for this country? So we have to start thinking about intellectual property. And it's quite consistent with being able to be openly publishing. In fact, patenting makes it more easy for you to speak about these things. So I think that's a proof that we have a culture problem. And part of this is to address to my own fellow scientists how they can contribute. It's not just about starting companies. It's about how they can contribute to using our resources, protecting our environment, and all the knowledge that scientists have contributing to the life of our country. I want to say something else about education, and I have that word in my title. Education in schooling. I mentioned we do very well. We did not always do well. In 1990, we were somewhere in the upper end, but not at the top end of the OECD. That's the PISA Maths and Science score the OECD uses. That's GDP per capita. 1995, countries had got better. Korea had massively improved. And the biggest improvement in GDP per capita and prosperity occurred in the countries with the highest score from secondary schooling. Secondary schooling is absolutely vital to prosperity. And here's the great news. New Zealand, in 2006, is now one of the highest in the OECD. We have a fabulous school system in New Zealand. You'll hear it knocked all the time. We have a fabulous school system in New Zealand, right? It's one of the great secrets. The rest of the world knows this. That's where we are now. We have no excuse not to improve our performance. We will improve the performance of our economy. However, there is an issue there. There is inequity. And the inequity in our school system is, if you break it down by ethnic group, you find that Pākehā and Asian are well above the OECD average in science, maths and reading. But Maori and Pacifica are lagging behind. And we have to address that gap, because therein, I believe, lies the fundamental cause of income disparity in New Zealand. We have to do a better job at providing true educational opportunity for all our young people and not just for a few. And yet, what do some schools do? They say, we don't offer the NCEA, we offer the Cambridge International exam. That's what they say. And why do they do that? Is it that there's something wrong with our education system in New Zealand? No, it's actually one of the best in the world. The problem is, we don't educate our kids to see a future here, and half them leave us and never come back. And what is that message that we send to our children when we say, we don't bother with New Zealand exams, we do the mother country exam? What are we telling them? It's a no-brainer to me. We've got to stand up and grow up and see the real problems and face them. Because the great tragedy of New Zealand is there's migration from New Zealand. And the dark arrow is graduates from universities. Of all the countries in the OECD, we export more graduates per capita than any single country. 24% of our graduates leave New Zealand and do not come back. 50% of the kids who come out of medical school leave New Zealand and do not come back. You can travel the world and your children will be there, and they are part of our enormously talented diaspora because they haven't seen their future here. And that is a real tragedy, and that's the educational problem that we've got to address. How do we create opportunities? And this is why I love this man, because this man should be in Burbank, California. He's a fruitcake, just like Jackson. They are here. Why? Because they're passionate, nutcase, New Zealanders who say, you know where I am, I'm in Wellington, come and see me. I want to be here. That is enormously important because these people are true global players and they've chosen to do it from here. And I'm so proud of young New Zealanders who go abroad and do well. But it ain't hard to do well in New York when you're well educated and hard working, or in London or in Tokyo. But take on the world from New Zealand and succeed, that's a real measure of success. And those are the values we should be offering to our young people. And what is the real opportunity? It's that you can make a difference. And I say to people who are part of our diaspora in New York, you might be surrounded by brilliant people, and it may be very stimulating, but you will never change that society. Come back to New Zealand, and you will not be surrounded by a lot of other brilliant people. You will have to be the one who provides leadership, but boy, you will make a difference. And that's the message that I think we need to give to our young people. The real opportunity to fulfil yourself in New Zealand is the chance to make a difference to your country. And I think that's a marvellous opportunity. And it's not just about science. It is about the creative sector. It is about the movie industry. It's about fashion. It's about our quirky design. It's about all sorts of things like clothing. But it's got to be smart, and it's got to be the best in the world, and it's got to be what the world wants to buy. I want to finish with a reason why this country will succeed. It's a dark and dangerous world out there in many ways. There are problems looming for the world. But in those fundamental areas, we are extraordinarily well placed. We have ample water supplies. We have renewable energy. We have an ability to deal with global climate change because we have multiple climatic regions. We are robust in that regard. We have excellent education, and best of all, we have a civil society. We are nice to each other here. Our politicians are nice to each other. Believe me, it's worse elsewhere in the world. We are a nice country. Who wouldn't want to live here if we make this a place where talent can thrive? It's an optimistic view, but it's one my old dad would have loved, because he was an optimist about everything except one thing, and that was my rugby playing. And I want to tell you, when I was 12, he said to me, Paul, I'm never going to watch you play rugby again because I find it too humiliating. And he was right. But I also learned to respect those who can play rugby. So I want to finish with this. Go the All Blacks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I certainly enjoyed your talk, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Pat Walsh, will extend our appreciation to Professor Sir Paul Callaghan.
Thank you, Chancellor, and thank you, Paul, for that inspirational and thought-provoking address. Occasions like this, which are relatively rare, when we get together to reflect on where we need to go as a nation and what our priorities need to be to get there, are instrumental in helping us choose a better future. There's no doubt that Paul has told us a compelling story this evening. He mixes insights with, dare I say it, common sense and science, and explains it all in such a way that lets us sit back and say, well, of course, that's what we need. At Victoria University, students and staff benefit from Paul's wisdom and years of experience as a professor, a teacher, a mentor and a science communicator. And I'm delighted that we were able to offer you all the opportunity to hear his analysis and be inspired by his vision for New Zealand. And we are delighted that you attended. Victoria prides itself on being integral to the capital city we serve. We're a community of 25,000 staff and students, and we recognise there is no point in working in splendid isolation. We will not be effective in our endeavours to solve problems, create new knowledge, teach the new generation of leaders if we do not share with you. And public lectures are one way we do this. While this occasion has been part of the Festival of Carnival event organised by the City Council, it is great to see that you Wellingtonians embraced this distinctly non-sport themed evening as part of the wider rugby celebrations. And I think it says something very significant about Wellington's distinctive culture and relates, in fact, to the argument that Paul presented to us tonight till we easily fill the Town Hall for this evening's lecture. I'd like to end by thanking the Chancellor for initiating this lecture, and please join with me in thanking Paul for his brilliant address.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance at this Victoria University of Wellington occasion. Thank you indeed.